The story of Ötzi's discovery is still one of the most astounding in human history. 1991. On a 10,000-foot glacier near the border of Austria and Italy, two hikers come across the body of a man, face down in the ice. They have no idea the importance of what they've stumbled upon. Perhaps it's a mountaineer, or even a lost soldier from World War I. But as they pull the remains from the ice, capturing the recovery on video, certain clues point to a different story. A knife made of stone, a shoe made of grass, a quiver of arrows, leather leggings, a copper axe. Carbon dating later reveals that the body and the items found with it have been preserved in the mountain ice for over 5,000 years. Ötzi becomes not only an international sensation, but also a scientific treasure.
He's the oldest human specimen we have that is so complete, so well preserved, with all the scientific disciplines that are intrigued by him, that want answers. He may well be the most studied human being in history.
Meanwhile, scientists continue to search for Ötzi's true identity, investigating perhaps the most revealing evidence available, Iceman's genetic code.
Genetics is giving us insights that we cannot get through any other means.
The genetic blueprint of every living thing is written in DNA. It's made of 4 chemicals, abbreviated as A, C, G, and T. These 4 letters, in a twisting double helix, are arranged into 23 pairs of chromosomes within each cell. This is our biological code containing all the information to build and run our bodies. Ötzi was one of the first ancient Europeans to have his entire code, or genome, analyzed. It provided detailed clues to his appearance and health.
If you look at a particular gene on chromosome 15, it's the gene that most likely determines eye color. If you see a pair of G's at this position, that likely means that the person has blue eyes. Whereas in the case of Ötzi, we see an A from both parents, and so that likely means that he had dark-colored eyes.
On another chromosome, number 12, 2 T's indicate that his hair was also dark. Other chromosomes reveal new details. Ötzi had blood type O. He even had a predisposition for arteriosclerosis, heart disease, often assumed to be associated with our modern lifestyle. The team also found DNA fragments from the microbe that causes Lyme disease, making Ötzi the earliest known case. But what about his origins? Who were Ötzi's ancestors?
The very cool thing about DNA is that changes in DNA literally make us who we are. The material that we inherit from our mom and our dad links us to all of our ancestors. And by comparing DNA across individuals and populations, we can get a very rich picture of our ancestry. Who are we related to? Where did they come from?
Finding answers is especially important because Ötzi dates to around the time when prehistoric Europe was undergoing major changes. As the ancient hunter-gatherer lifestyle was gradually displaced by farming.
Ötzi comes from an incredibly important period in European history, where we go from hunter-gatherers living in Europe to the widespread adoption of farming.
Because it's a transitional time period in which Ötzi lives, there are huge lifeways that converge, whether people are hunter-gatherers or whether they're early farmers. He's in transition. His culture's in transition.
45,000 years ago, modern humans first began arriving in Europe. They were hunter-gatherers, foraging plants and hunting wild game. Then, about 7,000 years ago, everything began to change. People in Europe began to cultivate crops for food. And by about 5,000 years ago, the hunter-gatherer culture had almost completely disappeared from the continent. It is one of the most revolutionary transformations in human history. Where does Ötzi fit into this changing landscape? Did he come from a group of ancient hunter-gatherers who still lived in pockets throughout Europe? Or were his people farmers, living a more settled life in the foothills of the Alps? Could the Iceman's DNA help solve the mystery and determine whether Ötzi's people were hunter-gatherers or farmers? To find out, researchers focus on mutations in the DNA, random mistakes that can occur when the billions of chemicals that make up our genetic code, all those A's, T's, G's, and C's, get copied.
The human genome is 3 billion base pairs long. Every once in a while, you get a mutation. And that mutation sometimes ends up spreading.
These mutations help create specific patterns of genetic variation in our DNA, inherited from our parents. The closer two people are related, the more of these patterns they'll have in common. So whose DNA does Ötzi match best? The hunter-gatherers or the farmers?
The only way to get at that was to have other ancient samples from known farmers and known hunter-gatherers from across Europe, across different points in time.
They found the sample DNA in the bones of dozens of ancient people excavated from archaeological sites all over Europe. Some samples go back 45,000 years, when hunting was the only way of life. Other samples were from 7,000-year-old farming sites. And the result? Ötzi's DNA is a close match to that of ancient farmers, not hunter-gatherers.
It became pretty clear that all of the individuals that we had labeled archaeologically as farmers were closest to Ötzi.
Ötzi's DNA reveals that he was descended from farmers who were in Europe nearly 2,000 years before he was born. What's more, the same DNA patterns show up in even older bones found in some of the earliest known farming sites in the world, in what is today Turkey. This suggests that farmers migrated to Europe from Turkey, filling much of the continent. Eventually, they pushed aside most of the hunter-gatherers and their DNA. So where is Ötzi's DNA now? Could he have distant relatives alive even today? Comparing his genome to modern DNA samples from all over Europe would provide the answer.
Who Ötzi really was genetically surprised us. When we started analyzing Ötzi, we figured, he was probably Italian. Wrong. Didn't cluster with the Italians. Maybe he's Austrian. Wrong. He didn't cluster with the Austrians. Eastern European? Wrong. North African? Wrong, wrong, wrong. So, where's this guy from? And it turned out, much to our surprise, that his closest living relatives were on the island of Sardinia. Totally unexpected.
Does this mean that Ötzi was Sardinian? Not necessarily. Most likely, 5,300 years ago, when the Iceman was born, most people in Europe, including Sardinians, carried similar patterns in their DNA from the early farmer immigrants. But over the last 5,000 years, Europe has seen wave after wave of new immigrants, adding new patterns of DNA to the mix. Except on the isolated island of Sardinia. There, ever since the early farmers arrived, the inhabitants and their DNA pattern have stayed relatively stable.
This wave of farmers that swept through Europe, made it to Sardinia, and stayed there as a genetic snapshot of what that wave of immigration looked like.
This makes today's Sardinians Ötzi's closest living relatives. Ötzi was a man on the move until an arrow ended his journey through life. But his death on the mountain would ultimately take him much farther than he could ever have imagined, and make him one of the most famous and fascinating humans who ever walked the earth.